Today, we undertake a critical examination of one of the most significant questions confronting the international financial system. Can the euro emerge as a credible challenger to the US dollar? Or is the dollar's dominance simply too deeply embedded, even in the face of what has been termed the unpredictability of Donald Trump? We have someone that has worked on these issues for a long time with us today. Photis' recent book provides answer to these questions. His research focuses on financialization, shadow banking, the economics of inequality, and the structural drivers of instability in advanced capitalist economies. And Photis has also presented his work a couple of times at City as well. And he always opened the debate on that Trump's disruptive tariffs and other policies have generated not only widespread disorder, but also growing dissatisfaction with the US. One result, it is suggested, could be that foreign investors begin to withdraw from dollar assets. So, is it true that Trump's policies may serve as the catalyst for the euro to finally realize its potential and mount a serious challenge to the dollar?
Well, first of all, thank you for this invitation. And it is, as you say, a very key question as to whether the current disorder, being amplified apart from anything else by Donald Trump's tariff and other disruptive economic policies, whether all of this will either weaken or strengthen the dollar. My own view is that I agree that, as many commentators have said, Donald Trump's actions have proven to be a catalyst forcing the Eurozone elites to start to take serious action and try and adopt policies that will help strengthen the euro's international standing and make it more of a realistic competitor to the dollar. So these are some of the statements that you see. Here's Kenneth Rogoff arguing that Trump is accelerating the dollar's decline and that the euro, even the renminbi, will come closer to the dollar sooner than one thinks. And here again, in the interview with Martin Wolf, Kenneth Rogoff argued that Donald Trump is an accelerant, he's a catalyst, and a time when the euro and the renminbi come much closer to the dollar, which people thought was going to happen 15 years ago, is going to happen a lot sooner now. I don't agree. I agree that Donald Trump is an accelerant, he's a catalyst, but I don't agree that the euro, let alone the renminbi, will catch up soon. I would wish it was so, but wishful thinking will not substitute for sober reality. And the reality is that it will take a long time, not just months, many years, for the euro to actually grow to a size where it can compete with the dollar.
Secondly, if you agree that Trump's actions are a catalyst for the advancement of the euro's global challenge to the dollar, why do you disagree on the timescale for its advancement?
Right. I think if we take this article by Christine Lagarde in the Financial Times, she argued, yes, this is Europe's global euro moment. But she went on to make clear that greater international prominence of the euro will not happen by default. It must be earned. Now, she emphasized the question of rule of law, independence of key institutions, and so on. But there are far more serious impediments also that I will come to in a due course. But the point to notice, if we take the euro's share in the foreign exchange markets, which currently exhibit 7.5 trillion turnover per day, you'll notice from this chart that from 2010 right down to the latest survey of 2022, the euro share has actually been declining. So where the US dollar has maintained roughly it's 88% share out of 200% to allow for double counting. The euro share in recent years, over the past decade and more, has actually declined from 39% to 31%. So it's been going backwards. And we have to ask why. The reason is its declining share of the world's securities markets, which in today's world are the real cornerstone of a currency's international standing. If, for example, we take last year's data for the bond market fixed interest securities, out of the 142 trillion stock of bonds outstanding, the US share was nearly 40%, while the Eurozone stroke EU share, which in capital market terms are roughly equivalent, was only 18.8%. And if we take the case of the equity market last year, 2024, out of the 130 trillion worth of equities, the US share was 47.4%, whereas the EU stroke Eurozone share was very small indeed, 8.4%. So unless the Eurozone increases its stock of securities, it's not going to challenge the dollar. But as I say, over the past decade and more, it's actually gone backwards on this score. If we take 2013, of the global total stocks outstanding in that year, 154 trillion, the US's share was 36.9%, 56.8 trillion. The EU stroke Eurozone share was 21.6%, 33.3 trillion. Now look at the figures for 2024. Global stocks, equities, bonds have gone up to 272 trillion. The US's share has increased to 43.4 trillion, i.e. 118 trillion. Look at the US share. It's percentage terms, it's gone backwards to 13.9%, while in absolute terms, the increase has been minimal, from 33 trillion to 37 trillion. So unless the Eurozone increases its shares of securities, which are used by the world's investors as portable, liquid stores of value, it's not going to be able to challenge the dollar.
So why is it that so many expert economists disagree with you as regards to the imminent decline of dollar dominance then?
I think the key problem is that securities, equities and bonds have no intrinsic value, so that they're often perceived to be merely IOUs, promissory notes. And in many cases, the fear is that if the US continues to issue a lot of securities, in particular debt securities, which are, if it issues so many securities relative to its production base, there may come a point when foreign investors will worry about the US's creditworthiness. And we see an example of this going back to 20 years or more, to August 2004, when one of the world's most foremost financial economists, Martin Wall, predicted in the Financial Times, August 17, 2004, that America was on the comfortable path to ruin because of its rising debt, and as a consequence, the dollar would suffer. Now, 4 years later, we had two renowned international economists, Chin and Frankel, predicting that by 2015, the dollar's dominance would come to an end and that the euro will replace the dollar as the leading currency. And why? Because the US has a 25-year history of current account deficits, and the dollar has a 35-year history of trend depreciation. If we come to today's situation, we find individuals warning that the US bond market, if it continues to grow, will crack under the pressure from rising debt. So we have a history of predictions that debt is going to collapse the dollar, and it hasn't happened. And we have to ask why it hasn't happened. And really, you have to think of securities debt and equity securities, not only as IOUs, promissory notes, but as stores of value demanded by the world's investors for use as places where they can park their funds. And what underpins the solidity or tangibility of these securities as stores of value is the strength of the US's governance and legal infrastructure. So when you put all of its bonds and equities together, then the size disparity separating the US markets from those of other markets becomes enormous. There we see the dollar mass in relation to other financial markets.
So the size disparity separating the US financial markets from all other financial markets, including those of the Eurozone, means that the world's investors have a shortage of alternative assets where they can place their funds. But is there no additional reason that lies behind dollar dominance?
Yes, there is. If on the one hand there's a shortage of alternative assets, I call that the negative reason why investors are not abandoning dollar security. But the positive reason, the additional reason, is the gravitational pull of the dollar markets. As we see here, if the mass of securities underpins dollar dominance, the dollar in turn repays the compliment by giving all these securities a degree of homogeneity, thus converting this mass into a single frictionless whole across which, a totality across which they can move funds without friction. So if we take that dollar mass and then deconstruct it according to its main constituent parts, we see that the core are the US Treasuries. These are figures for 2022, 90 trillion stock outstanding. And you see at the safe haven core is the US Treasury market, quite large. Then around that, US corporate bonds, then securitized bonds, securitized loans, and then 40 trillion equity. So what you see here is the ability of foreign investors to come into the dollar markets and be able to move across segments relatively easy without friction. And it's a measure of that attraction, that gravitational pull, that you see here, foreign investors in that year, 2022, having securities, dollar securities spread across the main segments. So there you have equities, close to 11 trillion held by foreign investors, corporate securities, then US Treasuries over 7 trillion in 2022, and close to US Treasuries are, of course, agency bonds issued by federal agencies like Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae. So 23 trillion. Now think about it, that when Martin Wolf was predicting America on a comfortable path to ruin in 2004, foreign investors then only held about 2.5 trillion worth of US securities outstanding and about 1 trillion worth of US Treasuries. Now look at 2022 figures, massive amounts held by foreign investors, including US Treasuries. So it's not true to say that foreign investors will abandon US securities because of fear of debt default. And so, no, the positive reason is, as I say, the strong gravitational pull.
Regards to the role of US Treasuries in central bank foreign exchange reserves. So it has been argued by, I think, Barry Eichengreen and IMF and by Christine Lagarde that this role is in trend decline while the euro's role here is set to increase. What do you think about it?
Well, first of all, let's talk about the trend decline in terms of percentages. There was a decline from 70% to around 60% occurring in the early 2000s with the appearance of the euro in hard currency form in 2002. But from the early 2000s to today, the dollar share of reserves, treasuries, has not really deviated by that much from 60%. So to talk of a trend decline is rather misleading. there was a sharp 10% decline early 2000s and then a steady variation around 60 pence since then. My second point is that they look at the percentage share of dollar reserves, treasuries, but don't look at the absolute volume here. Now, look at foreign exchange reserves from the early 2000s. The total volume around 2000 was barely 2 trillion. Now it's close to 13 trillion. So the dollar, while keeping 60% of foreign exchange reserves, we have to bear in mind that it's 60% of total reserves, which are now in the 12, 13 trillion mark, not 2 trillion. So we have to bear in mind the absolute values of these volumes and not just the percentage shares. And from that angle, you can see why the dollar still remains supreme. 60% of 13 trillion is quite a lot when you compare the euro's 20% of the same figure today. Okay.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but did not the events set in train by Trump's Liberation Day, in April, tariff program give a boost to the decline of the dollar safe haven status as there were mass exits from US Treasury bonds?
Yeah. The answer is no. You're right. When Donald Trump unveiled his Liberation Day tariff program, everyone across the mainstream media, New York Times, Guardian, Telegraph, but in particular the Financial Times, ran headlines saying that the disruption caused by Trump's policies, capped by his tariff policies, would lead to an exit from dollar assets, and in particular, US treasuries, thus putting its safe haven status, the dollar safe haven state, under threat. So you see here some of the headlines that were featured in the Financial Times all through April. Dollar's haven status under threat, dollar has further to fall, dark days for the less mighty dollar. And then to cap it all, on June the 28th, we see this article by Rana Farroha in the Financial Times, the specter of dollar doomsday still looms. Really? Well, last week, the tick data came out for foreign holdings of US treasuries. tick being Treasury International Capital. And what do we see here for the month of April 2025-04? Go down, and what do we see? That the grand total of US treasuries held by foreign private and foreign central banks was over 9 trillion. In other words, no change really from the holdings of the previous month, and indeed a substantial increase of the holdings of the months in early 2025, late 2024. So all this talk about mass exit turned out to be pure nonsense. What you had was some billions withdrawn from the treasury market, but 20 or 30 billion is nothing compared to the 9 trillion worth of US treasuries outstanding, held by foreign private and foreign institutional investors.
And so just return to euro. What are the barriers holding back the growth of the euro financial markets necessary for the euro's challenge to the dollar to be effective? Is it possible?
Right. So we've seen that there is no dollar doomsday, all right, because really the dollar in terms of reserves its share remains strong because it combines three qualities no other securities can combine, okay, or indeed other assets. So you can have other government securities that have safety liquidity but little value storage capacity. Cryptocurrencies have value storage capacities but lack safety. Gold combines safety liquidity, but its quantity is materially constrained. And you see that here. US treasuries are far greater than gold as a reserve asset or government bonds. But here, this is UK gilts, but here, German bunds. And now we begin to start to answer your question on the Eurozone. There are basically three major barriers to the Euro's challenge to dollar dominance. The first set of barriers is to do with attitude to government debt. Now, at the national level, we're seeing some change. So one of the results of Trump's actions is, for example, to encourage German government, the strongest economy, the government of the strongest economy in the Eurozone, to change its position with regard to its debt. It's always had a very restrictive position, and now it's loosening it up. So this is positive for the euro. But there's another problem. If the euro area is going to have a lot of safe haven government debt at its core, in addition to German bonds, it really needs joint Eurozone government-backed debt. This would really create volume. Unfortunately, while some governments like France or Spain support joint Eurozone government debt to be managed by the ECB, other governments, principally in the north of the Eurozone, the so-called frugal core, which includes Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, are opposed to joint government-backed debt because they do not want debt mutualization on the grounds this will encourage moral hazard. Governments that are lax in terms of tax collections, such as Greece or Italy, will be encouraged to carry on being lax if you issue joint government debt. So that's one problem. That's, in fact, a major problem, okay?
Well, but you also spoke about the Eurozone small government bond markets being a problem.
Yeah.
But what about the Eurozone's corporate security markets? Are these a problem too?
This is a good question. In fact, I think this is a very critical question, which is what I've got here as the second major barrier to the euro challenging the dollar, which is the European corporate external financing model. If you take, when we look at debt financing of corporations, we see a huge difference between the US on one hand and all other advanced market economies and leading EME economy like China on the other. In the case of the US, 75% of all external debt is financed through bonds. So the corporate bond market is, as previously indicated, a very important additional supplier of securities along with the US government. Only 25% of its debt financing is through bank loans. In the case of the euro area, the contrast could not be more stark, as you see. 88.5% of all their external borrowing is through bank loans. Only 11.5% through bonds. Now, unless the European corporations, the Eurozone corporation, start to change their debt funding model, we are not going to see a major increase in Eurozone Eurozone corporate equity and bond markets. So this is a key problem, and this is not going to change overnight. This is why I come back to the point that the time scale of the Eurozone challenge is far longer than is commonly supposed, because you're not going to change the funding traditions, which are very strongly culturally and historically embedded over recent decades. In the case of the Eurozone, you take Germany and others, the large corporations have got very close relationships with their banks. And it's been a financial relation type, which has proved in the past to be very powerful, a powerful motive for economic growth, post-war economic growth across the Eurozone area.
Well, so the Eurozone then needs to grow its domestic government and corporate financial markets to size and matching those of the US. That's my understanding. And is this size issue the only one that needs to be addressed?
Well, this brings me to the third major barrier to the euro's challenge to dollar dominance, which is really the question of the heterogeneity of the euro mass. If we go back to the dollar, the US securities markets are large, and when you aggregate all their equities or bonds outstanding, it's a huge mass that's back in the dollar. But the dollar also gives it currency homogeneity. But on top of that, you have across the US a uniform legal and governance transparency infrastructure. You have the same banking standards, you have the same accounting standards, and so on. So the dollar mass is homogeneous to a greater degree than anywhere else, which then, of course, is attractive to the world's investors. As we saw, foreign private investors hold a large amount of treasuries, but also a large amount of corporate securities. They can move from one asset class to another with very little frictions. If we take the Eurozone, it's not homogeneous. The single currency gave the Eurozone area a degree of homogeneity, but down below, we still have a lot of heterogeneity. We still do not have a banking union across the Eurozone, so that banks in different countries still have different rules and regulations, okay? We still don't have a single homogeneous capital market in the Eurozone because of different rules and solvency rules and so on. And it's a measure of that friction that the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the chief operating officer, said recently, we would like to increase our exposure to the Eurozone capital markets and shift some funds away from the dollar. But the problem is that we are confronted with real hurdles set up by the different rules and practices in the Eurozone financial sphere. So here again, we come to the reason why the Eurozone, to be able to grow to a size and depth and mass necessary to challenge the dollar, is not going to happen anytime soon. We have to overcome decades, even a long period of deep, historically, culturally ingrained traditions, which have resulted in a highly fractured Eurozone financial space. So while it's been positive that we do have the Eurozone in place and there will be scope for expansion, again, the lack of homogeneity is another reason we're not going to see the euro challenge the dollar anytime soon.
So what you're saying that the future looks bleak and there will be no challenge to the dollar dominance coming from euro anytime.
Right.
I just want to ask something else as well, because in your presentation that you had with us, you were also talking about other currencies as well, because there were a lot of debates on whether the rise of China, India, and BRICS, for example, could challenge dollar dominance. So I just want to maybe, and we focused on the euro, but maybe if you had general kind of comments on that as well.
The answer is no. It's interesting that when Russia invaded the Ukraine in early 2022, and then Russia was then confronted with exclusion from the dollar-based international transaction systems and so on, like SWIFT, there was talk that Russia and its allies in the BRICS association would move their trade and investment activities away from the dollar and use other currencies like the renminbi, thus strengthening other currencies, in particular the renminbi's role in the international sphere. These predictions that the renminbi, on the back of the BRICS initiatives might challenge the dollar, what was wrong with these predictions is they failed to look at the role of the BRICS currencies led by the renminbi or Chinese yuan, which you see here, in the global financial landscape. I said that the current turnover volume in the foreign exchange market is 7.5 trillion, right? Mm-hmm. Of that, only 8% has any connection with international trade or with foreign direct investment. 8%.
That's a really striking number, yeah.
92% in one way or another is finance related. Now, if we take that 8% and strip out the trade and investment relations between the EMEs, emerging market economies, and the USA, we find another 4% of that 8% is not intra-BRICS or intra-EMEs. It's with the West, but especially the US. So we're down to 4%, mm-hmm. Okay? And that figure is then reflected in the share of the currencies of China and other in the 7.5 trillion turnover. I said earlier that the US dollar accounts for 88%, or if we allow for double counting, 44%, mm-hmm. Right? At the other extreme, all of the EME currencies put together is 27% out of 88%, out of 200%. Or, put it in normal 100% terms, all the EME currencies is just 13%. Of the 13%, China's yuan is about 4%. The others, like the Brazilian real, the rupee, have a share of between 0.5% and 1%. Mm-hmm. So we have the EME currencies with 13% out of 100%. Now strip out the exchanges between these currencies and the dollar. The renminbi, if you take the renminbi's 4% share of daily currency turnover, half of that is with the dollar. So if we take out the dollar and other EME currency shares of the BRICS and EME currency shares, we find that it collapses to about 3 or 4%. So 3 or 4% is trade direct investment related between the BRICS currencies. 3 to 4% is their own currencies, excluding the dollar and so on. So their share of the current financial market is so small that however much it can increase, it will have no discernible impact on the dollar. Zero. Let's get our perspectives right.
Well, that was a really insightful message to end with. So thank you for joining us, our first episode. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me yet again. Thank you.